Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Day Zero podcast. This is episode number 17. With me is Auntie and Z. We got everyone back today. I almost didn't make it. We're a little late because I had some issues on my end, but we all made it. So before we have some discussions, Z, you wanted to talk about a little bit of meta stuff, right?
Yeah, I was just going to make mention that we have kind of launched our Day Zero Sec blog. Oh, nice and fancy. We have exactly one worthwhile post. The Spectre, you did your write up on the dev binder that you were looking at on stream.
Yep.
I guess the other thing is that we are going to try and keep kind of Fridays as was it Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern, I believe.
Was it 8 p.m. or 9 p.m.? What did we want to do?
Uh, I'm good with either.
Okay.
At either 8 or 9 p.m., we'll go live with kind of exploit development or some tool development Spectre was working on a kernel debugger. We'll go live with that on Fridays. Possibly some intermittent streams between there, just on impromptu basis, but we're going to try and keep that schedule for Friday streams and, of course, this stream.
Yeah.
Other than that, I think we can just jump right into the topics.
Actually, we did for one thing. We do actually have a Discord now as well, if you guys want to check that out. We'll have a link in the description below, but there's also one on our blog.
You can just click the icon and it'll take you over to our Discord.
Yep. All right, so now we're good for our first topic, which was Pwn2Own Tokyo. So I was following this pretty heavily when it was happening. Were you guys checking this out while it was happening much?
I saw kind of at the end of days. I wasn't watching it live though.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was just watching the their like updates while they were happening because I was pretty interested in them. I went I was a little bit I was kind of confused because they have so basically for those of you not familiar with this event, Pwn2Own it's basically an event where three teams in this case compete for trying to exploit real world devices. So they bring their 0 days to Pwn2Own, and typically vendors will push out patches the day before just to try to screw over those people. So, it can be tricky, but basically you bring your bugs to Pwn2Own, you try to exploit them there, and then there's people from the vendors on site that'll be there so that you get paid, and then they can ask you any questions, and the bugs get fixed.
Well, so it's ZDI that does the paying. So even if the vendor isn't on site, ZDI will still be paying for them. The vendor may or may not actually be there, but the big name vendors, Google, Amazon, all of them, they are present. But it is worth noting that.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, but I think the bigger thing is vendors are on site to ask any questions, so there's a better like flow of communication between what's getting fixed and the person who found the issue. But one thing I found weird was one of the teams had more than double the amount of slots of every other team. So fluoroacetate, which we talked about before back in, what was it?
Well, the last time we covered
right?
Pwn2Own.
Yeah, the last time we covered Pwn2Own, they stomped it, dude. They got every single one they succeeded in. This one, that didn't happen, but they still stomped it because they had 9 slots and both other teams only had 4 slots each.
So I know they withdrew on one of them, but did they have any failures?
I don't think they had any. No, other than the withdrawal.
Did they? Sorry, that's what it was. Yeah.
Did they have a partial? I don't remember that. I remember F Secure Labs had 2 partials and. Oh yeah, Fluoroacetate did have 1 partial. Yeah, you're right. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, look at that. Okay, yeah, so I forgot about that one. Actually, it looks like they had 2 partials, actually. Okay. So they weren't, like, entirely successful like last run, but they did have double the amount of opportunities, so it was pretty much guaranteed they were going to win before the event even really started, so I thought that was kind of weird.
I mean, that kind of comes down to who wants to actually participate in each of the categories. I mean, all of these teams can submit bugs into as many categories as they want. You can only submit like 1 attempt per like device per category. So like each category will have several devices, and then you can submit basically to every device. You can't submit multiple times to any device or to any kind of entry under the categories. So if Fluoroacetate went in there ready to go with more vulnerabilities, it's all the better for them. It's not necessarily unfair. just because they had more slots, because anybody else could have applied for more slots too.
Yeah, that's fair. And I guess that brings me to my next thing is like, judging by that, like how many slots went to one team and the categories, you'll notice a lot of the categories are like IoT stuff, right? You got TVs, you got routers, you got some phone stuff, but it's mostly like more embedded than before. It kind of feels like Pwn2Own's kind of losing some prestige, you know what I mean?
There were a good amount of embedded things, but I mean, I think that was more because just embedded was being targeted.
Yeah.
Because that said, I mean, so I saw some news reports about how Facebook Portal was going to survive Pwn2Own without getting popped. Which, good for them, but then I realized that basically only one thing in the home automation section even got popped, which was the Amazon Echo.
Yeah.
Nothing else is getting hit. So yeah, Facebook Portal survived, but so did, Nest, Google's Nest stuff, Amazon Cloud Security Camera, the Apple Watch, I believe.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I remember in past Pwn2Owns, you had, like, iOS kernel exploits and a bunch of, like, really cool shit kind of flying off the handle. This event, I think the only big phone one was the OnePlus one, or the OnePlus one, and they backed out of it.
Well, so there were,
Right?
I mean, the Galaxy S10 was compromised a couple times.
Was that just a browser, though, or was that
baseband.
Oh, okay. Okay, I forgot about that one, then.
Yeah, so there's baseband, and there was the browser also. But yeah, no, also it looks like, I have a note, they were also in the short distance category.
Okay. And I guess one other thing that's worth mentioning with Pwn2Own too is I remember I was talking in IRC with some people about it, and they were saying that apparently Chinese teams aren't really able to participate in it anymore. Apparently the Chinese government put out like a massive ban on participating in exploit competitions, they call it, outside of China or something like that.
Yeah,
so apparently that's kind of contributed to Pwn2Own being a little bit less, because like Chinese teams dominate that kind of stuff, right? So
yeah, I mean, we can kind of go into the whole politics behind China and their isolation.
I just wanted to like say that because that is a point to mention, is why, like, that is a reason why some people don't care as much about Pwn2Own anymore, is they feel like it's kind of mitigated by those teams not being able to attend. You know what I mean?
I mean, people are still going to go and discover. It's just we're losing those entries, basically. I mean,
Yeah.
which, sure, I mean, it definitely has an impact, but I don't think it devalues Pwn2Own at all.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so we'll move on. So ZDI, for those of you that don't know, is actually I think it got bought a couple years ago by Trend Micro.
Before you go into that topic, actually, there was one addition. While you were sleeping. Yeah. It was just going to be kind of a quick thing here about Google deciding to so we previously talked about kind of the Manifest v3 coming, which was where they block ad blockers. Kind of where you have that change there. So, officially this has hit the Canary version of Chrome.
Oh shit. Okay.
So officially it's in the pipeline. Obviously I'll go through Canary and it'll work its way up. So we're not quite there yet, but the ad blocker stuff, or removal of normal ad blockers, is coming. Just for some clarification on that, so we've kind of talked about a bit. Essentially what's happening is with web requests, kind of in the web extension API, there's this web request, and right now you can do these blocking requests that will let you tamper with the network request itself. Google's basically getting rid of that and replacing it with this declarative web request. And what you can do with that is you can basically set up rules and Google will do the blocking. So what this is doing is moving the blocking from kind of the control of the ad blocker to do some efficient blocking mechanism to Google having control of it. Where I think kind of understandably some people have some concern about having a big ad company in charge of how blocking actually happens. I'm not aware of the tricks at work, but I've seen a lot of comments indicating that there are some fairly simple tricks to bypass Google's rule matching.
Okay.
So that's kind of where a lot of these complaints are coming about ad blocking. Obviously, this is not super security related right now, but I think most of us can agree. Like, we care about the ad blocker. Ad blockers do have an impact on security. So I did want to make mention of this kind of, it's officially in the pipeline. So I'll just plug Firefox.
Yep. I mean, I've found the ways of Lord Firefox. So I've already made the switch. There was this, and then there was another thing. I can't remember exactly what it is right now, but there was something else with Chrome, and it was just like, yeah, you know what? I'll try Firefox again. Give it a go. So,
does this translate over to the other browsers like Brave that rely on Chromium as well?
I was wondering the same thing. It sounds like I don't know if they've changed their position on this, but back when this was first announced, I know Brave specifically said that they were going to keep that in there. Like, basically their fork would keep the V2 manifest support.
Right.
So it seems like some of those forks will be trying to keep that. I don't know if things have changed there. Like I said, I read that back when this was first kind of announced. So it does seem like some of them are going to try and keep it in there. I don't know how that's going to work, how it might be fairly easy, it might be difficult for them. So, we'll see what actually happens. But my understanding is there is going to be an attempt to keep it there.
Okay, cool. All right. So now we're going to talk about Trend Micro, right?
Yeah.
All right. So Trend. There was a rogue Trend Micro employee that sold customer data for 68,000 accounts. So speaking of Pwn2Own, we had this amazing story that came out. Pretty much, I think it was around when it was happening. I think it was close to it, or maybe just after. They said that a rogue employee sold the data of 68,000 customers to a malicious third party. Who then targeted customers with scam calls, and then they say they made sure that to say that he was terminated, and I was kind of thinking, I'd hope so.
Well, you never know. Could be a promotion.
But it contained information it's mostly like PII, right? You got names, email addresses. They
occasionally phone numbers, but it didn't seem to have. Oh no, this didn't seem that sensitive to me. Obviously, names and emails are, but definitely limited. I mean, used for, as I said, it went out for scam calls. Like, this could definitely be used for some, fish, like spear phishing and stuff. But
especially the support ticket numbers, because if you have like support ticket numbers you recognize, you're more likely to trust the email. So, but
it adds some legitimacy to any sort of phishing attack to be able to pull in this type of information. That said, it's 68,000 accounts, but Trend Micro has somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 million customers. So this is a very small amount of users. Obviously, those that use this customer support.
Yeah, I think the other thing that was interesting is that, I mean, it doesn't really expose all that much, but I would be pissed too if some dude's like, knows my ticket number. He goes, yeah, we were supporting you, but actually this issue came up where, I mean, it could be used intelligently. It just sounds like the employee was dumb, and I would be very fascinated to know more on, like, how much money did he make from this? Like, you're now obviously never going to work in this industry again like that.
Yeah, so, like, I mean, there's a lot of trust that gets violated with that, so I mean, there's a chance that he like intentionally did it. Perhaps he was scammed into kind of doing that. I don't think so, but we don't really have the information to say that he wasn't either. But yeah, there wasn't any information about that kind of released with this report, as far as I could see.
Yeah, well, the overall idea should be don't be an insider. You'll get caught, basically.
Yeah, it is a reminder though, like, insiders are a real threat. I mean, oftentimes, like, you look at kind of the perimeter security and kind of forget about the fact that insiders get a lot of access.
Yeah, it actually happens. I might be curious of how they compromised it, the data itself.
I mean, this could have even been somebody like working, in the support center or whatever.
Yeah. All right. So we'll talk about another rogue employee.
Yeah, and this one
Uh,
actually does include some money information, which I found really interesting.
Yeah. So, ex-Twitter employees spied on Saudi dissidents. So, am I wrong? Wasn't there another case of this a while ago where Twitter got caught? Like, there was another Twitter ex-employee that sold, that was doing spying for another nation? Or am I crazy here?
I'm not sure if
Auntie,
you're
do you remember?
crazy. I don't recall anything myself, though.
Okay, Auntie, you might know more about that than me. Do you remember this happening before?
I want to say, are you sure it was Twitter? 100% that we're basically helping track dissidents or something weird like that.
Yeah, maybe I'm thinking of another company. But yeah, no, it's we'll talk about this one because I can't remember exactly which one I was thinking
Yeah,
of.
I guess to be fair, this did happen, it seems like, in 2015. They do mention that these accounts were accessed in 2015.
Yeah, it's just they've
Or,
officially laid charges now.
yeah.
Yeah.
Although, kind of speaking on the details of this, essentially, as Spectre kind of mentioned, 2 Twitter employees are charged with accessing accounts on behalf of Saudi Arabia. This includes like some very outspoken dissidents and obviously people that are not supporting the country. So you can kind of imagine pretty clearly why they wanted to know kind of account information about these users. It was 2 employees, but only one of them accessed like several thousand accounts, whereas the other one accessed 3. I think it was.
Wow, that's
Like there's a
interesting.
huge difference, and the thing is, it does mention that the one who accessed 3. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find it in the document here.
It
No
was
problem.
100,000 if you want to control
Yeah,
that
so
back.
he was paid $100,000 over those 3 accounts.
Damn. Or maybe
Because
was he caught in the middle of it, so they didn't get more use out of him, or was it just for those 3?
that's unclear.
Okay. Yeah, because it would be interesting to hear how he got caught with it. Because it sounds like something that's kind of hard to get caught for, you know?
Yeah, well,
Like in that
especially
kind
at
of
low
position.
numbers. Like I could make sense, or I could understand if it's when you access. I want to say it's like 6,000 accounts. That guy getting caught, and he was fired and immediately fled to Saudi Arabia. Whereas this other guy, a U.S. citizen, accessed like the 3 accounts. That seems harder to detect. So it seemed to me like he might have been like just did a favor for this other guy or something, but might have hit like these really high profile accounts. Again, we don't get that information, but I don't know. The
It's
100,000
too
seems
bad.
like quite a bit to be paying for just the few accounts.
Yeah, but Saudi Arabia, with all the money they have, it's not too surprising. um, but I mean, I think this brings up an interesting point. I mean, obviously, like you said, this is from a few years ago. It's from 2015. Twitter did mention that they put some steps in place to try to mitigate the amount of access that social media employees have. But like, it's kind of crazy how much access social media employees have to this kind of like intimate user data, not just on Twitter, on Facebook, on Twitter, on everything. And like they say that they put in measures to try to restrict user info to only people who require it. But my problem with that is like that's kind of vague. What deems a requirement to it? If it's just like a report, then that's not too hard to get around. You know what I mean? Like I think it's worth like thinking about how much access these employees have and how easy it is to abuse that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a hard problem to determine what information somebody does need, especially at kind of that granular level of user by user.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely not a straightforward, like, obviously, there are certain users that just should never have access. Like, in general, you don't want, like, developers, while they need access to a database, they shouldn't have access to production. There should be that separation. Whereas a lot of companies definitely don't keep that. Developers get access to prod or get access to that. But uh, when you start getting more to the level of like support workers, like which users do they specifically need access to? It gets a lot more tricky.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how you really solve the problem. I guess the only way you could really solve it from your end is just don't use social media, but
Well, I
that's not
think the
really
big
a
thing comes
thing to
down,
do.
rather than just hard limitations, better auditing of it. Why did somebody access this account or that account?
Yeah,
I
that'd probably be how you have to go.
think you guys would be surprised. I bet you this was years ago, right? You said 2015.
Yeah.
Like a lot of insider threat now is pretty nuanced. Like it's not still very sophisticated a lot of times, but I guarantee you, like the 6,000 must have been once they were kind of eking through it. I bet you they started. These are just two of the insiders we heard about. Like once they start kind of finding a crack, then it starts turning into this like, holy shit, we've got to investigate everything, and then it all comes falling down a lot of times for insiders because that happens. I can't name certain companies, but there's a lot of companies that they find one insider using one particular technique or one system to query something that they weren't supposed to. Then they audit everybody and they go, well, wait a second, why are there 10 people doing this now? What the hell is everybody doing here? So I'm guessing that's exactly what happened here. Is the reason his number is so low is because someone caught on pretty quickly. Like, wait a second, this guy is just a web, front end developer. What the hell is he doing accessing this database? Just my guess.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a possibility. But yeah, we don't really have the information to make any conclusion there, though.
I mean, one thing that I do wonder about is like, why Twitter? Because that seems like Twitter seems like
definitely
kind
of a basis for kind of rallying people up. So
okay,
obviously Twitter's
point,
being
really
used. Like what, 1 million followers for the one account that was targeted.
Okay.
It's being used to rally people. People will rally kind of around certain Twitter accounts. Like, I'm not a big Twitter user, so I don't know all the terminology, but I mean, yes. I apologize if I don't say your name right, but Halsey Klein said there, protesters use Twitter. I mean, it's being used quite a bit. Part of that probably does come down to the apparent anonymity of using Twitter. I mean, you're just making these quick mentions. That's it. You're not necessarily attaching that with your real name. It's just out there for everybody. And you can get a very wide reach with Twitter.
Yeah, it's easier to get reach on Twitter than it is on some other ones like Facebook, that's for sure.
Yeah, well,
okay.
I mean, Facebook's kind of limited to your social circle. You might look at something like Reddit being used for that also. But it seems like, Twitter kind of has an advantage of being able to promote that, social outrage, basically. Like, it's very easy to just retweet it and get that message out.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I didn't really know that Twitter was used that much for that. I thought, like, the protesters used more of, like, Telegram, stuff like that. Those more
that's more like direct communication, though. Trying to raise awareness, Twitter is definitely getting used for that.
Okay.
But I mean, that isn't to say they aren't reaching out to other companies also.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so Auntie, I think you're gonna. I'm gonna ask you some stuff about this next one. So we're talking about OpenTitan. So I'm thinking about something else later on because it's kind of got the
you're thinking about titanium.
I'm thinking about titanium, not Titan.
You can ask me anything you want, though. Don't you hesitate.
Yeah. So for our listeners, Auntie's kind of our threat guy, whereas Spectre and I both do more of the exploit development stuff. So asking Auntie to talk about hardware or secure hardware,
it's kind of a meme.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, OpenTitan. So this seems to be like an open source tool. They call it a root of trust project.
Well, so it's open silicon. That's kind of a really key thing. This is open hardware, not just open source software out of Google kind of doing this. They already have Titan. They're opening it up.
Okay. So from what I can tell, the main purposes of it is to prevent firmware corruption through like low-level malware and stuff like that. They have a little list here. Provide a unique machine ID, which is cryptographically secure. They protect keys, even from those with physical access, which I thought was an interesting point. And they try to make it so that like audit records and stuff like that are tamper-proof.
Yeah, so, I think they tend to prefer saying tamper-resistant rather than tamper-proof. But yeah, like the whole idea is this is a root of trust. It's kind of like your root point that is always trusted by the operating system. It's that point where your operating system or something higher up can go ahead and refer back to and always trust. So you can think of it kind of like, security coprocessors, trusted platform module, that sort of thing. But a lot of those are obviously just kind of like black boxes. They're there, you're supposed to trust them. Many of them have been compromised in the past.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, this reminds me a little bit. We talked about a Microsoft thing. Was it last podcast or maybe the podcast before that was similar to this? It was
The
similar to this, right?
secure core.
Yeah, secure
computers.
core. Yeah. So is this similar to that in a way? Because it seems like it's trying to accomplish some of the same goals. So
It's possibly similar in a sense, but just in the sense of the same goals. I think the big thing though with this is the open aspect of it.
yeah,
Obviously,
that's
right in the
definitely
name,
bigger point.
OpenTitan.
Yeah, I mean, and it's definitely not like a small thing either. Like, it's got some big partners. You know, you got Google, you got Western Digital, at Zurich, which is a university in Germany. Like, there's some big groups that are partnered with doing this stuff. So
That's a university, not Ethereum.
no, I thought it was Ethereum at first too. No, the only reason I know that that's a university is because I think Flo goes there. I think he has it in his Twitter bio. He does. He's, for those who don't know Flo, he's like a Vita hacker. So I remember seeing that in his bio. So I was like, oh yeah, that's a university. So yeah, it's mainly aimed at being open. They do have a GitHub repo. I wanted to check out a bit more about it, but you know, because it's more hardware stuff, like most of it is System Verilog, and I have no idea about anything with System Verilog. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to check out as much as I wanted to.
Yeah, I
But
mean, I'll be honest, it's definitely at a lower level than anything I work at, so I can't really comment on that, on like the specifics of the security. But it is nice to see something trying to do some open source silicon. I mean,
yeah,
that's something that's kind of been, um, I won't say called for, but like people have been asking for that for quite a while. So it is nice to see a large company, as you said, some large partners actually take some steps towards that. Because it does go, like, I mean, we can debate whether or not open source is necessarily more secure. I mean, obviously, you've got things like, you know, the classic example now, OpenSSL, open source, and just no eyes were actually looking at it. Maybe that'll be the case with OpenTitan, where, you know, it's open source, but not necessarily more secure, just nobody's looking at it unless it's getting used somewhere. Although, to be fair, OpenSSL was being used too. And people were just kind of trusting it. I don't think we necessarily want to dive into that debate right now,
well,
but
I
it's
wanna
definitely
touch on
related.
something.
Sure.
I mean, what you were saying with OpenSSL, you know, I don't know. I can't get into the minds of everyone, but I think the big reason that not a lot of people are looking at OpenSSL is it's very complex. There's a very high barrier into trying to
Well, but
understand what's
is
going on there.
OpenTitan going to be a low barrier? Is it written in Python or something?
No, but that's what I was gonna bring up. Is like not a lot of people are huge into hardware like they are with software, and I think because of that, even though OpenTitan is going open source, I think it'll have a similar issue. I don't think there's going to be a lot of people looking at it because there's not going to be a lot of people with the knowledge, like the prerequisite knowledge to be able to understand what it's even doing. You know what I mean? Like, I think that is a good point to bring up. Is like it might not be as looked at as they think.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, you know, come go to Google, they have their own internal teams that do security. They're generally not terrible when it comes to security, so I'd have hopes for their own internal setup there. And I think the more something's, when it becomes something critical, like if we start seeing this in the phones, like the phone hackers are going to be exposed to it, it very well may get targeted by them. It might not. But yeah, because it is hardware, it's great to see the open hardware. I don't want to discourage that. But I do want to make that same point. You know, there aren't a lot of people that are necessarily going to have the level of understanding to find the more nuanced issues in this or in just open hardware in general. So, I mean, we just kind of have to trust that they are going to look at it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll have to get Spirit on this shit, you know? But, yeah. So we'll move on to Sandboxie. So I'll be honest, I remember using Sandboxie a few years ago. I used to use it quite a bit. I haven't really used it since. But for those of you that don't know Sandboxie, it's basically a program where you can throw a program into it, and it'll be like it's a sandbox that you can use. So it was shareware. It wasn't free. Well, they had a free version, but it was quite limited. The paid features, they had forcing programs into using it and running programs on more than one sandbox at a time. So, back when I was on like a forum and stuff, and I was using a lot of tools for modding games and stuff, I definitely used Sandboxie. But basically, what's happening here is they're actually going to open source it. Because Sophos, which is the company that makes it, they were actually saying that Sandboxie wasn't really a significant source of revenue for them, so they were gonna kind of kill it, right? They were gonna make it go EOL, but instead they wanted to make it open source because they didn't want it. They felt like it would kind of be a waste if they killed it. So I think this is actually really cool. I think, obviously since they're making it open source, those paid features are free now. It's not open source yet. They're still transitioning into it. But
this is the plan to kind of transition. I do want to mention this feels kind of like the end of an era. Sandboxie, I remember Sandbox kind of back in the WinXP days. I didn't use it as recently as you did. But it was definitely pretty it was definitely pretty popular back then. And obviously, as kind of browsers got a lot more secure, I definitely saw its use kind of drop off. And to be clear, kind of the way this thing sandbox is, it was mostly a file system sandbox. It would sandbox kind of all of your file system rights. It would put them basically onto an overlay that was completely separate from your... it was on your real drive, but it wasn't actually overwriting your files. It would just kind of map it so it would think it was doing so. Very similar kind of to deep freeze for Onyx.
Yeah. So I'm interested to see when this goes, like when the source actually goes out and the transition is complete. Like, do you know anything about Sandboxie's implementation? Like what they used, like what language they used for it or anything like that?
No, I don't.
Okay, so that'll be cool to see. But
I'd have to assume it's probably C.
Hopefully,
given kind of the lower level stuff. Obviously this is written before Rust was out, so it can't be Rust.
You watch, they'll be ahead of the curve. They'll be using Rust before Rust is a thing. But I think it's something to keep an eye on, and I think maybe there could be some people to come up with some cool forks and stuff of it. So
so I definitely think like the technology behind that, like the overlay, can absolutely be useful. I can't remember what type project I was working on, but I do remember looking for something that did that because I didn't want to implement it myself several years back. So it'll be nice that it's there. Have it out. It's always nice to see things coming into the open source where people can try and play around with it and do something with it. I don't know what people are going to do with it, but there's definitely a place for it, and it is a significant piece of technology.
Okay, we got some people in the chat saying let's use Pascal. So, all right. So now we're gonna get to the titanium stuff, Auntie. Now I'm gonna ask you about it because apparently this titanium is like a code name for a backdoor or malware.
Yeah, that came from the Platinum APT.
Yeah, so Auntie, apparently like this is like a major group. Like apparently it's one of the very complex groups, unlike some of the groups we were talking about last week. So do you have like any interesting information on Platinum, I guess? Like any previous stuff they've done?
Well, I want to say there was only one that I remember, something weird back in, ahead of in 2018, 2017 when they first kind of came out, and there was something insane that I thought was like, it wasn't even really like something that a normal APT group would use. It was something directly over like LAN. Let me see if I can. Basically, this is a group that's been around for multiple years, and really almost no reporting that I've seen has really gone deep enough into them. They used something though that was like hardware type of exfil, and I can pull up maybe if I find an article. But the long story short, it's another probably Chinese group that this time around they decided to amp it up a bit. So I thought it was cool that if you look through it, if you go to that article, and I'm not sure we can share it, there's actually one that I highlighted where there's another article that the actual researchers posted where they have the actual image that was staked that they would pull the backdoor from. But I can go into probably any part of it, but it is very complex. If you look at the actual release of it, I guess on SecureList, it's actually like multi-stage overly complicated where everything's encrypted, opening like kind of archive. Like each part of it was meant to be something that if you caught on to it, well, then the whole process got screwed up and you wouldn't figure out what the backdoor was. I don't even think the actual original researchers were able to figure out what the shellcode itself actually like did fully. So I think I can jump into any part though. Did you get a chance to read about it?
Well, I will just kind of comment in here that I thought it was interesting that they used some steganography. I don't know. I mean, you see steganography in CTFs all the time, and they're always a challenge category that I hate. So it's always fun to kind of see it, being used, obviously for, in this case, delivering some data. But yeah, I mean, it just seems like a very convoluted process, which I mean is good for them to stay hidden. Obviously, it's using those tricks to evade antiviruses and all of that.
Yeah.
What?
Go ahead, Andy.
Well, I was gonna say, I think there was one that was like LokiBot used it, and like the hard part is for like someone who's just, I mean, obviously antivirus isn't gonna know what the hell an image file really, if it's hiding something that's commands to run a backdoor, it's not gonna know how to, it's not even gonna find that. And also for like most analysts who look at this, they're gonna look at a picture gets pulled down and go, what the fuck is going on here? I have no clue what this is supposed to mean, especially because it looks like just a fish. But you can go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I remember you were talking about like the shellcode stuff. So that does bring me to some of the low-level stuff they get to. So let me just, bring that up. So they have a little paragraph here talking a lot about how it works. Or not a lot, but a little bit. So Titanium uses several different methods to infect targets. So one of them is the local intranet. Another one is SFX archive with a Windows installation task. And the third one, this is what kind of brought me to it, is shellcode that gets injected into WinLogin, but they actually don't even know how that happens, like how they inject that shellcode. So, there's still stuff that's unknown about this malware, and that's how complex it is. I thought that was kind of interesting. But bringing it back a little bit to the threat intel stuff, you were talking about how you thought that the group might have been from like China or something like that. One thing they mentioned in the article is the malware was primarily targeted against Asia, the Asian Pacific region. So, I do you know of groups that target like or the origins of groups that typically target that region, like where they are? Is it typically inside that region itself, or is it somewhere from another region that usually targets that area? Do you know? I mean, it's kind of a vague question, but I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to ask about it.
Yeah, so I mean, if you kind of look, I think on the other article, and let me see if I can send it your way. There we go. So basically, they had like 3 that they showed as the infection map. Now, that's only the campaigns that have been caught on. So I'll always say this with the preface that there could be more out there. They just don't know 100%. But if you look, it's Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, which normally to the Western world is not really a huge target, right? The US doesn't really target a lot of those countries. And if they do, they're not going to go and spend a massive amount of obfuscation. And again, these techniques, I think the part to take into is these techniques are like very advanced and probably a bit even overkill. But obviously the people that wanted to target, and we don't know who the individuals are that they were targeting, but were targeting individuals within those areas, had a very concrete reason for doing so. So they want to ensure 100% there was no chance of it being probably discovered, right?
Yeah, like it does mention that, they were using spear phishing and O-Days in their campaigns, which definitely differentiates them from a lot of the threats that we've looked at. Not necessarily the APTs, but a lot of the threat actors that we have kind of seen before doing more generalized campaigns, just using an exploit kit, whatever, that has, N-Days in it. Whereas, this is clearly being quite targeted.
Yeah, and those little countries, I mean, I know there's a few other ones. A lot of them in that the seas that are adjacent to them, China and various other countries have been fighting forever over who technically owns them and weird stuff like that. So that's just part of it. There's a lot of weird politics between a lot of these, like what they call the APAC, the Asia Pacific countries. So I think when you look at, most times when people go, well, how do we know it's China or this and that, besides sometimes technical indicators, right? Like language packs and stuff like that, it would really just come down to who values targeting this specific country, right? Would the US, would the UK, would any of those more Western countries go and say, I want to target Indonesia? For what purpose, right? And not to say that it isn't, but if those countries are targeting these areas, it normally isn't in a use like this, right? This would be someone that, as I kind of iterated, they really wanted to make sure that no one knew what was going on, and they probably obviously were trying to target like high value people, right? If it's spear phishing. So honestly, most of that APAC targeting that you're going to see is almost always China, almost always, or someone trying to pretend to be China.
Okay. Do they directly say that it was a nation, like it's a nation state? Like, do they have any information on that would point to it being a nation state as opposed to just a really advanced group? Or I don't remember it saying anything about that, but I feel like that would be some useful information to know. But at the same time, I also think it's not information that's easy to know. So I didn't know if you managed to catch anything that would suggest that.
I mean, well, the reason I'll give two parts is they put it out there as, the first sentence is it's one of the most blah 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 advanced groups with traditional focus on the APAC region, right? So this isn't the first time they've detected this threat actor, right? That's how we know probably that they're hinting at China. But the actual part which you're asking is how do they know it's not just some very sophisticated baddies, right? As opposed to a full-on nation state.
Yeah.
So it comes down to like the differences between a hacker who's just kind of working in the scene trying to make money through whatever and a nation state, right? There's different motives. Like an actual hacker, for the most part, they will have campaigns obviously where they go and try and target people, but a lot of times it's not as much spear phishing like this that we're seeing here, wasting what I would call as a very sophisticated chain of attacks, which is not to say that a lot of like the baddies don't do that. It's just you won't normally see them do this. They'll take things that are already out there, exploit kits that are already out there. They'll use typically like one or two novel techniques. Like, oh, that was really cool. They don't make it so that the whole attack chain is nearly impossible to figure out what's going on, right? I don't see enough threat actors usually that advanced. Now, to say if there was one that was that advanced, it would really come down to, that's where again that motive of it would. And to be fair, I think we don't have who they were targeting. We don't have what the message was, so we can't tell, right, some of the other information. But if you look at who they're targeting, if it's high-profile people, or typically like education's a big one that a lot of APT groups target, like who are they targeting is a very important factor. And I think if they're trying to hint at a group that's typically targeted those in this region, it's because they probably are very confident that they're targeting their capability. And again, since it mimics capability they've seen before with this particular group. So that's how they normally determine. You're right in that it could be any number of, maybe it's just a very sophisticated actor, or it could be even another nation state, right? Where we've seen with some of the leaks previously by some US intel groups that they have the capability to mimic other APT groups. So this could be very well, some type of other country pretending to be one country and so on and so forth. If that long-winded answer.
No, that's good. Like I found it very interesting because I don't know much on the threat intel side, and that's actually cool. I didn't really know that. I mean, it definitely makes sense, but I never really thought about nation states trying to mimic other nation states. Like when you hear about it, you're like, okay, that makes sense, but it's not something you really think about. Kind of makes you question everything you know about, or what you think you know about like APT groups and stuff.
I don't want to be kidnapped for saying that. I just want to point out to any agency listening, I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm saying maybe it's a possibility.
All right.
Well, I mean, false flags are always a possibility.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Alrighty. So, let's move to Facebook groups. So there was Facebook groups API, and there was a flaw that exposed data to 100 developers. I will say, I'm surprised it's only 100. Like, I guess this API or whatever was a very limited one that not a lot of developers used, because 100 is pretty low compared to some of the numbers we usually see.
It might have only even been some sort of partner. I think they kind of make mention not just of developer, but of it being particular partners that had access to it. not just. So I don't think it was something you could just sign up to as like a random developer.
Okay.
But that's it. It's a little bit unclear exactly what happened, but the gist of it's this: using this API, group admins. So you have a Facebook group. You can add apps to your group. The apps would have access to things like the group name, membership numbers, post content, but it shouldn't have access to member names or their profile pictures. Users would have to opt in to that. What sounds like it happened is some apps, and this is just quoting the article, some apps retained access to group member information, like names and profile pictures in connection with group activities from the group's API for longer than we intended.
So that is one thing I wanted to highlight, was the longer than we intended. So it seems like it's not like data that they shouldn't have had access to in the first place. It's just they had access to it longer than they should have, which I think is an important distinction. It's not as, I don't think it's as bad.
I'm not sure what this actually means though. Like, does this mean that perhaps the group's API was only supposed to show them like the people's name for 1 year back, like they can look back 1 year and it let them go further? Does it mean that maybe people after they left a group, they can still be identified as having been in the group? Like there are a lot of ways you can interpret this, and I think if somebody were to leave the group and in theory have their information deleted or whatever, if people were still able to pull that up, like that's pretty bad. If it's like, oh, they were able to pull up like 10 months when we only want them to pull up 8 months worth of data, it's a little bit less worrying.
I mean, this is just a slow news day for Facebook, honestly. This is basically in reaction to all the Cambridge Analytica shit that's kind of rattled them. I think what it's trying to say is that, there's a lot of fear that Cambridge Analytica and a lot of these analytics companies were basically mapping out individuals to their groups of friends and stuff like that. So they probably realized that, some of these companies are still able to, and we're probably still pulling information from groups that really was more extensive than just, hey, this person is part of this group and they have this interest, right? Or something like that, where it goes and maps it out much more detail and granular that they probably realized they shouldn't have exposed. So, I mean, it's probably pretty tame compared to the billions of other stories that keep coming out about Facebook.
This did seem pretty tame. This does seem like it's just more related to the higher level of auditing they've been doing. Like, it felt a little bit nitpicky to me.
Yeah, no, this just feels like a Facebook story that gets some clicks, and it's just a developer post too. So I feel like it's just being able to throw it out there, but I don't see anything that's that spooky about it just at this point.
Yeah, no, I'd
agree. Limited. Yeah. All right, so we had some laser beams. It's always fun when we have lasers.
And it's a named Vaughn. It's got its own website.
Yep, that's how you know
Thank
it's good.
God. Thank God.
So it's pretty cool. It's novel. They're essentially using lasers to control smart home tech from like across a distance. Like some distances, we're talking like hundreds of meters in some cases. Well, 100 to 200 meters in some cases. So basically, I don't know fully how it works because I don't know much about how like electrical signals and stuff work. But basically, it abuses how microphones work, right? Microphones convert sound into electrical signals, and they basically trick it by using the intensity of a light beam to produce electrical signals as well. So if you can target that, you can make smart home tech do, certain actions like you would with a voice command.
Yeah, I mean, the gist of it is use lasers, to make it think you're talking. Yeah, like that's the gist. I feel like most people on here have probably seen that. Yeah, as Philip Schreier mentions, how to hack Alexa with thousands of dollars of equipment.
Well, that's actually the thing, is I'm trying to find exactly where it is, but they mention you don't really need expensive equipment to pull off the attack. There's actually lasers like, they say do light commands require special equipment, and they say it can be mounted with a simple laser pointer, which is like under $20, a laser driver, which is a couple $100, and an amplifier, which is $28. I mean, you can pull off this attack for like a couple $100. It's not $1,000 plus attack.
Well, so I think the distance has more to do with the cost. the stronger laser, they're a lot more restricted.
Yeah,
In order
so
to deal with the longer range. So I guess it does mention here that telephoto lens could be used, another $200.
I I only had one thing I wanted to ask that I felt was crazy that no one else has really talked about is they mentioned phones and shit, dude, and I feel like it's pretty crazy, but I only see the iPhone like XR and like Google Pixel and some random shit. But they're kind of like I thought what was cool is they talked about maybe brute forcing like pins, and I'm pretty sure like my phone has if you like get locked out after 10 times, it just wipes your phone. Uh, I wonder if out of for laughs and giggles, like that's where I see like threats being is like someone could just screw you over and wipe your entire phone
Will the
from a
iPhone
distance.
lock you out when you're trying to unlock it with voice commands, though?
Well, that's
I
where
imagine it
I was
does.
curious though.
Well, I
Does it
mean,
not
will it
prompt
actually
you?
wipe it on voice commands? I thought that was mostly with actually like trying to enter it. Maybe it does. That's the other thing with this is it does require a line of sight. Usually people have, their phone in their pocket.
Well, if you're at a
Um,
coffee shop, maybe across from the bed. I mean, this takes a lot of
like there
planning.
are places it could be done for sure. I think trying to aim through a window though can also you're going to have to deal with refraction and stuff as it passes through the window. Like that definitely makes it more difficult too, unless you're setting up your laser, in the corner of your coffee shop. I mean, this is a fun attack. There are some questions about the practicality of it.
So one thing I did want to mention is they have a little table here of devices they tested and like the laser power and the range, like the max distance they had at like 60 is that milliwatts? Is that what the MW
MW,
is?
yeah.
Yeah, milliwatt, yeah. So at 60 milliwatts and at 5 milliwatts. So the phones actually have quite a low max distance. So not only do you have a line of sight issue, but you also have to be within 5 meters of it for the S9 and the Pixel 2, and 10 meters within the iPhone. So, I mean, there is a lower max distance. I found it interesting how, like, you see, like, most of the numbers for the smart home tech is like 50 plus. But when you get to the Facebook Portal Mini, it's only 5. I thought that was
Interesting.
kind of like, yeah, it's kind of a standout in terms like the only other ones with 5 are smartphones. So I wonder why it's so much lower for the Facebook Portal Mini. I wonder if it's just because it's harder to get a line of sight on it or something, but I imagine they factored into tests, so I don't know. It's just it's a bit weird. I thought that was worth
Maybe
bringing up.
no one's screaming from the next room over, "Hey, Facebook Portal Mini," but maybe it has something to do with like the range people use it with. I don't even use it, so I don't know how it works. But
So
that is
I'm
a good
actually
point.
not too familiar with the Facebook one.
It's
Like
new.
how big is it?
I'm not sure, but I know the
I'll
Portal
Google it.
Mini is pretty new. I think it just released within the last couple months.
Yeah, it looks like it's
Um,
about tablets. Or well, no, that might just be the Facebook portal.
I see. It looks like a little photo frame. I can
Yeah,
imagine.
well, these look like tablet size. I'm just not sure if that's the mini or if that's just a normal Facebook portal. Nonetheless, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's insanely small.
Yeah, I mean, bit of a side note. I'm kind of hoping nobody has a Facebook Portal Mini. I mean, we're talking about Facebook like almost every other episode because of bad shit they do. So, nobody buy this. Just because they have a smaller distance for this doesn't mean you should buy one. So,
You
just
can
thought I
still
should throw
sponsor
that
us,
out there.
Facebook. You can still sponsor us. That's okay with me.
Something that actually could be impacting that, that just came to mind is perhaps since it is almost like a tablet like, it might have kind of like that glass over or like by where the microphone is. That kind of limits how much light will pass through, compared with more direct, like just having kind of the microphone accessible with plastic around it or whatever, being a bit more phone like. I don't know. Not really my area, so I can't really say for sure, but I just had that thought pop in.
I mean, that's a good. Yeah, I never really thought about that. Alrighty, so let's talk about Real Bob. Who is Real Bob? So this
Actually,
kind of
just
connects a
before
little bit.
we jump off, I did want to mention that they do talk about pin brute forcing, which I was kind of going to go off of when Auntie had mentioned the pins.
Okay, fair enough.
They do talk, doing some brute forcing of the pins through that. So the Alexa limits you to 3 attempts. But it sounds like Google on their service, they'll delegate kind of the pin auth over to, the device provider. or like apps, all that. Like they'll delegate it out, and they claim that a lot of those end up lacking security, making like pin brute force using this method fairly reasonable, and that seems like a bit more feasible of an attack than some of these. I mean, a lot of their examples are like, opening the garage door, but I don't know. I mean, do you know a lot of people that have their garage door opener connected to their IoT systems? I mean, it definitely seems believable. I just haven't really seen it.
Mine just shouts my social security number every time you prompt it to. But
well.
I mean, I think they mentioned that you could get it like if you had per se. I think the idea was you could send commands, kind of, right? Like it's very stupid. I don't even know if I believe it myself, but to say it out loud. But I wonder if you found a very dumb flaw, right, in one of these things, like again, Google Home or something like that, and you go and you say, okay, I know that I can run shellcode through this weird light, transfer, right? I feel like there's an attack surface sort of there, but it's almost so convoluted I don't want to believe it and say it. But that would make sense. Then you can exploit it through that, and maybe you can go in and listen in on the room. Like I don't think it's crazy necessarily. I mean,
no, but it is a little bit out there, I guess.
It takes a lot of effort, is all I could see. I mean, it's great because you have basically a box sitting with that can record voices and conversation, but I don't know if dropping an exploit through sound or light waves, it's cool as hell, but that's the only thing I could see it being cool for. Otherwise, it's like Mr. Robot, shutting off their lights and on and opening their garage open and this and that. Like, I don't know who would do this besides assholes.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, there is always the potential that things will, as IoT grows, it'll be more adopted into that stuff.
I think that's inevitable, honestly. People show that they want smart stuff. People shown that there's an interest in it. They want more of it. Maybe not people in our, area, security stuff, but, the common everyday person, they definitely show interest in it because of the convenience it brings. So, yeah, I think these kinds of, attacks are going to become a lot more relevant as time goes on. So one thing they mentioned they can like kind of mitigate this is speaker recognition. But they say that might not be great because there's ways to get around that. And our next topic actually focuses on attacking that speaker recognition directly. So the paper name is Who is Real Bob? Adversarial Attacks on Speaker Recognition Systems.
Yeah, and I mean, we can talk about the paper, but I actually think, and unfortunately I can't play this over for you guys to hear, but I am going to play it on stream. I'm just going to play a couple of their sound samples, because I think you'll kind of get this attack if you hear the actual sample. If you guys, I just opened up the sites, you should be able to see it, and you can play some of these on your own. But the thing is, essentially what happens is you have kind of your normal recorded voice here, and they have the with all of these attacks, they kind of go through and they have the original voice, and then they show their adversarial voice. And this kind of takes a similar principle with the adversarial attacks on images, where you have those very subtle, weird little changes in the image, and all of a sudden it's being, classified, your picture of a cat's being classified as a picture of a bird, or things like that. That's kind of what's happening here, where they're trying to trick it into accepting the voice in a few different situations. So the first one that they look at, I believe, is just on open set identifications. So that's basically an attack where you have several registered users, and when this adversarial voice is played, it should be recognized as one of those registered users, or it rejects it if it's none of them. So to use the one here, I'm gonna play.
Which one are you gonna play? So I'll play two.
So I'm going to play Mike's original voice here.
Okay.
So that's from the top mic.
But the real significance and comfort of the words, "for our sins," is lost upon them.
So I just played that 5-second thing of Mike's voice that they're comparing with, and then the attack, which the system thinks is Mike speaking.
The piled up vapors condensed into water, and the air put into violent action to supply.
You can tell, like, that's not Mike's voice, but you can hear that static in the background. That's the attack. That little bit of stack that they're adding, and I believe This is the original voice that was rejected, so there's no static on
Piled
it.
up vapors condensed into water and the air, put into violent by the vacuum.
And then there's
left
the
by
attack here
condensation
again.
Of the mist.
If you're trying to play it, I don't think we can hear
Yeah,
it.
you can't hear it, but the podcast can. That's what I had mentioned.
I'm not the stupid. I'm not the stupid, I promise. It was a test.
So with that, I mean, you can kind of hear that static there, and that's the attack. So we can go and talk about it. But I think just being able to hear, you can see what it's doing. Well, you can hear what it's doing.
I mean, what I think is worth mentioning is they mentioned that it has a pretty good success rate, 65%.
Yeah, it was
roughly
a very
on
good
open
success
source
rate.
and commercial. But the other thing is too, I think success rate is less of an issue here because typically, if your voice command or something like that on an IoT device, like what we were just talking about, isn't recognized at first, you just do it again. There's no real, even if the success rate is low, you can just keep doing it until you get it, right? It's not like there's not really a limit on brute forcing it, kind of, with this kind of attack. I feel like it's an easy attack to brute force, so even if the success rate is low, you can just keep hitting it until it works. Will they actually? Okay, that's news to me because I didn't know that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And it seems one of their goals with this was also to make it so that it's not very easy to detect from a human side that the samples were adversarial. Because, I mean, if you listen, like the one we listened to earlier where there was noise in the background, it's easy, if a human listens back to that sample, it's easy to dismiss it as, oh, it's just background noise.
Yeah,
You know what I
I'm
mean?
just
It's
going
not
to, sorry. Apparently I was muted during part of that and didn't get unmuted.
Okay.
So all I was saying there, sorry for that. What I had mentioned was that they did perform this attack against the Azure speaker recognition platform. So they actually play this out to a microphone to pick it up. So a lot of these attacks and the samples that I use look like they're being played again. Like they control the actual audio file being parsed. But they did perform this attack with an over-the-air attack. And basically just played it out to a microphone, adding the noise a lot louder, a lot more noticeable in that. It still sounds just like, wind or something in the background. But yeah, so this does work over the air too.
Okay.
Which is basically what I was saying, I think, while I might have been muted for the stream.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Balika. So, yeah, I mean, I looked a little bit more into the paper. I didn't listen to these sound samples. The attack looks pretty complex. It deals with sound waves and stuff like that. So, if you're not a physics major or something, you might be a bit lost reading on the specifics of the math behind the attack. But they actually do propose some solutions to these types of attacks. So, one of them, they were talking about doing more advanced detection methods. So, trying to attach unique identifiers to how the lungs and vocal cords and stuff like that affect your voice. They also propose training with adversarial samples, which we've seen other papers mentioned before with more AI stuff.
Yeah, I mean that just seems like a given. Training needs to happen with adversarial samples. That's basically no duh at this point. Almost everything we tend to see here ends up being some sort of simple adversarial. Well, maybe not necessarily simple, but Adversarial samples need to be taken into account. If you're not, you're doing it wrong at this point.
Yeah. I think the other two solutions are pretty cool, though. One of them they mentioned was compression can be used to mitigate it. I didn't really understand, like, I guess that has to do with, what it does to the sound wave or whatever. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The compression can kind of mitigate the effectiveness of the attack. And the other thing is they mention having like authentication voice lines, kind of. So they talk about requiring the user to read a randomly generated sentence to kind of authenticate it. So that way, even if you have an adversarial, voice sample, if you don't know the authentication phrase that it asks for, it's not going to accept it anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but that just comes down to how quickly you can generate these adversarial samples.
Yeah. So I mean, they're kind of they're not solutions that are going to solve the problem entirely, but they do have some ideas of ways to kind of mitigate its effectiveness. But yeah, this was one of those papers that it was cool and it was practical, right? Like that success rate was 65%. Statistically speaking, within 2 tries, pretty much guaranteed in 3, you will get a successful, run. So it's practical, and that's one thing I really like when we get papers like that are practical.
Yeah, I think it's cool. So, I mean, we've seen a ton of things that attack the vision with those adversarial things. This is the first time we've covered some that kind of does it at the audio level.
Yeah. Okay, so use after free vulnerability in libarchive.
Yeah, so some technical vulns now.
Yeah, we're getting into some technical stuff. So libarchive, it's a compression library. They mentioned some things that use it here, like CPIO, tar, Zcat.
Yeah, I think tar is probably the most familiar to me. Nautilus, Arc, or Pacman, actually, I think for some people, if you use Arch Linux, Pacman will use it. Samba's SMB client, CMake. Like, it's definitely well used. I mean, like I said, I'm most familiar with using tar, and I don't think I've ever used tar on an RAR file, which is where this is. This is a use after free in the RAR format. Basically, you get the gist of it is while it's processing your RAR file, if it's compressed, so if you're using the just stored level of compression, it's not vulnerable. But if you're writing the attack, you can set up whatever you want. So it's in it's when it's being compressed at some level. When the read data compressed fails, it'll give back this archive underscore failure. And it'll free the context, but it won't set the flag to start a new context. So when it goes on to the next header to the next section. Well, so that's the thing. I don't know if tar can actually do RAR, but libarchive, which tar uses, can do RAR. That's the thing. I haven't actually looked. I mean, a lot of these, I feel like in a lot of these cases, it was new to me also. So in chat, Belka is just mentioning that, or just asked if tar can do RAR and mentioning it's new. That was new to me also. Like, I mean, libarchive's use, I don't know for sure that RAR works it, but like, the library supports it, whether or not the command is actually wrapped it. And that's similar with some of these other things. Obviously, I imagine the file browser will support it. But anyway, basically, the gist of this attack, it frees that context and then carries on. So it's the next time it does a read data, which usually wouldn't end up happening, but if you craft your file right, like the next header, it'll just use that same context over again. So use after free. The patch itself was, really small.
Yeah, so I was going to say it's a very simple UAF, like, very straightforward.
Yeah. Like I just pulled up the patch here. It's, literal. They added one line and a couple braces.
Yeah. I mean, I heard a little bit about this earlier because they mentioned that FreeBSD has libarchive and its base install and core system. I'm not entirely sure what it means by that. Like, libarchive and its base install, okay. But, like, how is it used, really? I'm not sure. Because I don't really use FreeBSD.
It seems like a lot of tools
so.
like BSD tar will use libarchive. Okay. Like, that's what it means, I believe.
Yeah. So for the people that will inevitably ask, can we use this on the PS4? No, because libarchive is not used on the PS4. So we'll get that out of the way.
Is libarchive being used kernel level too?
No, I mean, well, userland is still a problem on
I'm
the PS4.
going to write an operating system where the entire kernel is RAR. It's got to save on space.
Yep, absolutely.
I think that's in Temple OS, dude. I think it's in Temple OS already.
So kind of related, not really security related. Do you say RAR or RAR, or what do you say?
I say RAR.
Okay, that's kind of what I say in my head too, but I wasn't really sure.
Okay.
Is there a lot of debate for that?
No,
Probably.
I was just wondering because it's not a clear pronunciation. Well, their website probably tells you exactly how to say it.
Probably like the GIF, paper
GIF.
does. I'm not getting into that. All right, let's talk about SpecuSym. So there was a paper, SpecuSym, speculative symbolic execution for cache timing leak detection. So we talk about speculative execution quite a bit on this podcast. Obviously since the Spectre and Meltdown attacks, they've been kind of the pinnacle of this era, I guess, for security, for like kind of an I win button. If you want to target things, they were present in a lot of things. They're hard to fix. So, it's definitely a big topic. So this paper is basically, they're proposing a symbolic execution engine for validating timing side channel attacks. So for those of you that don't know, symbolic execution, it's basically trying to, emulate what a binary does based off its symbols. So, you'll see plugins and stuff that can try to do this in IDA and stuff like that. It's not very easy. It's kind of a pain in the ass to set up. And they actually mentioned that it's even more of a pain in the ass because, or at least in this context, because most symbolic execution engines don't actually support speculative execution. So they kind of had to do some, pave some new roads to be able to do what they wanted to do here. And then the other thing is, part of the reason that symbolic execution engines don't do speculative execution is there's a lot of overhead with having to analyze every potential path on cache misses and stuff like that. So yeah,
I feel like we talked about something else. And I couldn't find it in my notes from past episodes. So I'm not sure where. Like, for some reason, I thought it was 007 when we talked about that on episode 14. But did we not cover something that used symbolic execution? Basically, it would just set like we're going to execute another like 10 commands or like 10 instructions after every branch. And that was just kind of, it just did that. It just assumed there was a miss and did that. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, because I couldn't find my notes on it, so maybe we didn't talk about it, and I'm just imagining things, and this is actually, like, I'm going to go do a master's to implement it.
I mean, yeah, I don't remember that discussion.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Yeah, for some reason I thought we had covered something that was kind of similar to this. Although, to be fair, one thing that is really important with what this one does that's different from a lot of the previous work is part of what that symbolic execution is. It's determining inputs that will witness your cache, like the vulnerable behavior. That way it can kind of detect false positives. So they refer to another paper and its findings. They're like, nope, these are false positives. So that is one thing. So it uses constraint solving. It'll go through and basically it'll model kind of the cache behavior, and it'll model like all of the conditional branches of the application, and it accumulates all of the caching side effects with like all of the conditions or all of the compare branches and stuff. And it'll construct all the conditions that are all of the leak conditions on memory access, and then it uses some constraint solving to perform its cache analysis and actually find paths to all of these vulnerabilities. So that's its way of tackling kind of false positives.
Yeah, so one of the things they compare results with is Wu et al. And I feel like that might have been what you're thinking of, because that seems familiar to me as well.
So I actually did look at that paper, and no, we didn't cover it.
Okay, so maybe it was one we were going to cover, but then we trying to toss at the last minute or something. But yeah, so they compare it with that on the 9th page. I'm just scrolling down to it now, and they compare with Wu et al. So they do miss a few things, like on the hash test and on the OCB test. They didn't detect a leak where Wu et al. Did. But I think the big thing is, you're missing those false positives. So I think it shows some promise, and even though it missed a few, I think it's still worth it due to that elimination of false positives. And on top of that, it also generates precise inputs for leak exposure. So, like, I feel like just eliminating the false positives alone makes it kind of a superior tool. I don't know if you agree with that, Z.
I don't entirely agree. So
Okay.
I don't think you're wrong, but at the same time, I think somebody who's knowledgeable in security, I'm just gonna say like a security engineer, can sit down. They can take a list of issues, false positives and not false positives, go through that and determine what's legitimate. So because you have to get every issue, like the ultimate goal is fixing all of the issues. So to have some being missed, like, yeah, it's great to have no false positives. On the flip side, though, an engineer can look at that and just determine, okay, this one's a false positive. So they wouldn't end up missing things, although it does take a little bit more legwork.
Yeah,
So it's a different perspective. If you're trying to automate something on the basis of this, then yeah, okay, no false positives is probably the best route to go. But I'm not sure I just agree that it's better just because it has no false positives. Because I think a common process is you use the scanner to give you some places to look at, and then you do some manual assessment on your own, rather than expecting the program to be able to do everything.
Yeah, I mean, where I think the reason I think it's so useful is like, you're right. You can get a researcher to go through a list and see which ones are false positives and which ones aren't, but I think that removes a lot of valuable time that could be focused elsewhere. And that's where
so
I think,
I think this can, I'm definitely not
useful.
saying this is invaluable by any means.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
because this could also be used, like, you use some that gives you false positives, you use this which doesn't, merge them, take out or take note of all of the overlapping ones, and then look at those that didn't overlap. And obviously you are trying to, it's kind of the war between false positives and false negatives.
Yeah. Man, that's a good, maybe we should title the episode that, war between false positives and negatives. There you go. But yeah, I think it was pretty cool, and it is more accessible than some of the other speculative execution things that we see out there. So it does get pretty technical, but in terms of, like, as far as speculative execution goes, I think it's a little bit more accessible than some other stuff out there. Our next paper, though, I think could have been made a little bit more accessible, because I had to lean on you for this, Z, a little bit.
Yeah,
So,
this one uses a lot of acronyms in there.
Yeah, so for those of you just listening, the paper's title is WEIZZ, I think you say, Automatic Gray Box Fuzzing for Structured Binary Formats. So, as far as I could understand, it basically tries to use byte level changes and tags them. So it'll try to see how like comparisons is one thing they seem to target. They try to target, is the comparison byte by byte basis, or is it just on like a group of bytes as a whole, like a D word or a Q word or something like that? And
Yeah,
then based on that, they try to detect what type of data it is.
Yeah, so just before we keep jumping into that, I'll say this is the idea of this fuzzer is that it will be structure aware without actually needing to define your structure, without needing to have like this big definition file. That this thing will figure out the structure of the binary formats itself. It'll detect things like checksums in the file, or like any sort of interdependency like that. Magic bytes that's fairly easy for most things to detect. So it builds off of some concepts out of just coverage-based fuzzing. So you'll see that was one of the things with AFL, was that it was a coverage-guided fuzzer. Looked at kind of your coverage, your execution, like how many instructions were being executed, all of that. So this kind of builds on that concept and starts looking at, Spectre was mentioning there, it'll take the bytes to know kind of how how these different comparisons use the bytes, and it'll build up the relationship between them. So it does a specific look for checksums, and stuff like that. And then it does a structure where fuzzing. So it does kind of do some similar stuff, like, again, he references AFL a lot there. It does like the Havoc stuff where breaks everything, just to introduce some Havoc into the fuzzing. But it uses its knowledge of its, or what it's determined as fields and what it's determined as chunks. And, we'll do a meta level fuzz on that, like adding chunks or adding fields and removing them, things like that. So it takes into account, or it tries to figure out the actual binary format without you needing to spend a ton of time writing up that definition file, which is always a pain to do.
Yeah, I mean, I learned a bit from you and this paper, because I don't really do file format fuzzing. Like, it's just not something that I've really looked at. So I imagine the checksum stuff is something that's probably important and probably does cause a bit of a barrier for getting like code coverage and stuff. And they actually do have like a little chart. They compare it with AFL Smart. I'm just trying to find what page it's on because I forgot to write it down. But they compare it, and in pretty much every tool they tested, they got higher code coverage on WEIZZ than they did on AFL Smart. So they tested on like readelf, decompress, libpng, ffmpeg, a lot of tools that are heavy on file parsing. And yeah, it was either on par with or better in like every case. So
except for it looks like ffmpeg, if I'm looking at that graph right.
No, because WEIZZ is blue, so they're doing better than the other ones still.
Or sorry, DJPEG. I was looking at that as being labeled on the bottom, but they're labeled on the top.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so DJPEG, yeah, you're right. So that is one outlier. But I mean, yeah, so for those of you who don't know, like I was, I mean, obviously you wouldn't know. When we were first talking about this paper a little bit before talking about it on the podcast, I kind of went to Z. I was like, so I don't really see what they're bringing new to the table. So what they're bringing new is what Z just explained, and you can definitely see that they are bringing something new to the table because they are getting higher code coverage metrics than other popular tools, or at least AFL Smart. And code coverage pretty much is like the benchmark for fuzzing, as far as I can tell. So
yeah, I mean it's what we've got right now. You'll definitely hear. We'll say like it's maybe not the best benchmark to really use, but
it's all you got.
Yeah, it's what we have, and it's something we can measure.
Other than the amount of issues it finds, obviously that's.
Although on that, obviously this thing did find some real world findings, and I love that this one actually had. They found a House of Spirit issue, or like something that could lead to a House of Spirit attack, which is it's an old heap attack. Well, old. I mean, it's part of Days Maleficarium. If you're familiar with those, the old Malloc papers. I liked seeing that there. I used to do a bunch of heap stuff, so I always like kind of seeing that pop up.
Yeah. So I think they said that it found like 11 or 12 issues, like real world issues total. So it's pretty awesome. Like a lot of these papers you'll see, it's a lot of like stuff in theory that you kind of wonder, okay, is this going to work in practice? These guys actually did try to find some real world issues with it, and they did.
To be fair, again, it looks like 6 of them were null pointer dereferences.
Still though, I mean,
it was 11 0 days.
Sometimes. Like, yeah, this is another one of those papers where it's clear that the practical implementation is there.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, with most fuzzers, a lot of like it'll have findings. A lot of them aren't going to be exploitable. Like that. Yeah. That's just true with a lot of fuzzers. So like, I'm not trying to hate on this one because it had a bunch of null pointers and a division by 0. There's still issues. Fuzzers find them. You just have to determine whether or not you can exploit them. Like I mentioned, I did find the one House of Spirit base, or like foundation for a House of Spirit attack. So yeah, it has some real findings in real applications.
Yeah. So we've saved our best topic for last, and that is checkra1n. So POC 2019 happened in South Korea. POC is Power of Community. So they're a conference that runs every year. They're kind of closed off. You may get slides for some of the stuff that's there, like we do here, but you don't always like. You'll never get like video recordings or anything of the talks. But yeah, it's definitely a pretty popular conference, especially among higher tier security researchers. You know what I mean, like more professional ones, kind of things. So this presentation by QWERTY was named the one weird trick secure ROM hates. So one thing I do want to say about the title is I posted this on NetSec, actually, the NetSec subreddit, and I noticed some people saying they were a bit confused because apparently there's another technology called secure ROM without the E on the end of secure, which is used for DRM, apparently. So they thought it was an attack on that, not on the iPhone secure boot ROM. So, I thought that was something worth bringing up. But yeah, it's on the iOS, the iPhone secure boot ROM. So, we talked a little bit about Checkmate when it first came out a couple episodes ago. So checkra1n is basically building on top of Checkmate to get more useful features for developers and hopefully for like a full-fledged jailbreak a little bit later on down the line.
So I will say that seems really quick to go from we just talked about Checkmate to conference presentation.
Yeah. I mean, it was a pretty quick turnaround on it. There's a lot of people involved, right? QWERTY is like the he's
but I guess
seems,
that's a really quick turnaround on even being accepted to a conference.
Oh, definitely. But I mean, considering how many high-level people are working on it in terms of the iOS scene, I mean, you have AxiomX, QWERTY, like there's a lot of big names working on it. And, this is like a bug that hasn't been a thing in like over a decade. I can definitely see why conferences would scramble to make room for them.
Oh, absolutely. It's just, it just seems really quick. That's all I'm really getting at.
Yeah. So, like I was saying earlier, there is a lot of people involved in this project. So I checked out the slides when it first dropped, and I gave them a quick reread. About half of the slides are about exploiting the vulnerability and a little bit more information on that. Like they talk about the USB stack and exactly how that all happens and how the UAF happens. The other half of the slides are post-exploit, and I think those are probably the more interesting ones, just because that's what's kind of new. There's some stuff, like we linked the write-up, I think, last episode or the episode before that, for the how Checkmate works. So this kind of reiterates over some of that, and then the post-exploit stuff, I think, is what's more interesting. So they mention how it's tricky when it comes to supporting multiple devices, because without hard-coding offsets, right? Because when you have different different devices, different versions, you're going to have different builds. So those offsets for your exploit chains or anything that comes post-exploit for patches and stuff like that, they're not going to be consistent. And hard coding kind of sucks. It's not very, well, it's pretty much anti-portable, right? So they mentioned some tricks they try to use to get around that. They use like patch finding on the bootloader and the kernel. And they mentioned some challenges that came with that. But at the same time, since you're hitting it from the bootloader, they also have some things going for them. Like they don't have to deal with kernel text read-only region because you can just disable that from boot. So, you get some, it's kind of like blessings and curses. You get some things that are, you don't have to worry about, but then there's some other challenges that you don't necessarily have in other cases. And they mentioned that you need a lot more than just kernel patches. You want to retain code execution in userland to prepare that jailbroken state. So the way they basically do that, and I think what the core of checkra1n is they create a RAM disk and they pass it through kernel boot parameters. But they mention some issues with that too. Like it has to be really small, and they want to make sure it doesn't contain any Apple code. That way Apple can't, come after them for like copyright and stuff like that. So, if you're interested in the iOS stuff, especially post-exploit, I think this is a really good slide. These are some really good slides for you to read. They also, near the end of it, talk about some future plans. So a few things they want to do is they want to have like loadable kernel modules, which I think will be really cool. You can do a lot of cool stuff with that. And dual booting dual booting and Linux on iPhone. So, I think checkra1n was actually, there was like an alpha kind of released just yesterday for those people that want to check it out. They do recommend not using it on a primary device because it's, so new and it's in like kind of an alpha state. But yeah, I mean, checkra1n's looking pretty cool, man. And these slides have a lot of cool information in them. So I don't know how much you guys managed to check out these slides. But yeah, from what I gathered from them, it's I think the coolest part was probably the post exploit slides on the later half.
Yeah, it definitely sounds interesting. I didn't have a chance to read over these slides, so I can't comment.
Okay, that's all good. Okay. Auntie, did you manage to hear anything about checkra1n? I know you've been busy lately, so I was just wondering.
I think most times when people talk about it, I don't think anyone's necessarily jumped into it because I thought it was still, kind of waiting to see what happened, right? I know we talked a little bit about
for a lot
this
of people, that's still the case. I mean, for developers, there's some stuff out there to play with. For end users, though, I think it's still a little whiles off. Maybe like, within a few months, hopefully. But there's definitely progress being made on like, jailbreaking, like old school kind of jailbreaks. So I think that's pretty cool. So yeah, definitely check out these slides if you're interested in the Apple stuff and want to see some of the under the hood stuff. One thing I will mention, it wasn't in the slides, but there was another tweet about it. So one kind of issue that they're trying to resolve with checkra1n is you can't really use it unless you have a Mac. You can't run the exploit or checkmate rather on Windows or on Linux because because it's through the USB stack. There needs to be some like the proper interface code in like the kernel and stuff for doing that. So they mention even that running like a Hackintosh and a VM might not even work because of the USB stack stuff. So at the moment, if you don't have a Mac, you might not be able to use this, and I think that's an important thing to bring up, especially to any developers that might be listening that want to tinker with it. But it looks like they are trying to get around that to make it work on other
Belka
operating
does
systems.
mention that Linux has that, so I'm not sure if that means that Linux has the right stack for it or not. But
I don't think it does. I'm pretty sure like it's an Apple specific thing. So
they
the
are saying that
checkmate
checkmate
works fine on that. I don't know. I've heard differently, so I don't know on that.
Your
maybe I'm
mileage
wrong,
may
but
vary, I guess.
yeah, YMMV. But yeah, that's pretty much all of our topics for today.
I do have a couple of things actually to add on.
Oh, you do? Okay, go ahead.
We won't have any new pages coming up here, but I do just want to mention that it looks like basically early this morning, Project Zero dropped a few more bugs.
Yeah,
looks
I saw
like
some
we've got
iMessage stuff.
yeah. So the couple iMessage things, but they've got Acrobat or Adobe Acrobat Reader has an uninitialized pointer in OTF fonts. And in JBig to global stream, I don't even know what that one is. And then yeah, a couple iMessage issues. Out of bounds read and attacker controlled read locations. So I just wanted to kind of make mention of those. They dropped this morning. You can take a look at like the Project Zero bug list if you want to pull up the information on that. If they're interested, we might cover them next week.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll end it off by saying I think everybody should probably, if you're on Twitter, follow this Project Zero Bugs account. I think it basically reads for new bug drops and, you can kind of see them first. Yeah, so I definitely recommend like anybody who's on Twitter, follow Project Zero Bugs. They got some cool stuff that goes out, so... Yeah, but I think that pretty much summarizes up all of our topics. We'll reiterate from the start of the episode, we do have a Discord now. The link will be in the description in the YouTube VOD. It's also on our site. There's a little clickable icon on the far right. And we are going to be continuing exploit streams or tool development streams on Fridays at 8 or 9 p.m. Eastern. So try to tune into those if you can. But if not, we will see you on the next podcast. So yeah, I think that's it, right? We don't have anything else to add?
No, that's everything. So we will see you guys next week.
Cheers.